Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Lord, and I'm the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Middle East Security Program here at the Center for a New American Security. 1 month ago, the Palestinian terror organization Hamas launched an attack on Israel that was unprecedented in scale, sophistication, and depravity. Before the terrorists were subdued, they murdered 1,400 men, women, and children, wounded thousands more, and took 240 hostages back to Gaza. The gruesome assaults and murder, many captured on video by the assailants themselves, were unspeakably horrific and has evoked comparisons to the atrocities perpetrated by ISIS. Israel, still reeling from an assault more deadly to the Jewish people than any day since the Holocaust, launched a military counterattack that eventually neutralized the invaders and began an air campaign against Hamas's terrorist infrastructure in Gaza of an intensity and operational tempo unmatched in modern military history. The civilian casualty toll in Gaza has been high, as Israel has aggressively attacked terrorist targets, which Hamas has purposefully embedded behind, within, and underneath Palestinian civilian communities and infrastructure. Israel's campaign, the stated purpose of which is the total military and political elimination of Hamas within Gaza, has entered its second phase, a significant ground incursion. The IDF has cleared and encircled the periphery of Gaza City and has begun attacking into the city itself, moving deliberately toward the heart of Hamas's resistance, believed to be located in and around the neighborhood of Shati and Al-Shifa Hospital. While doing so, it has maintained corridors within the city to enable civilian residents to flee south. Additionally, it has been reported just today that the IDF will engage in a pause for 4 hours every day to better enable the evacuation of civilians and the delivery of critical humanitarian aid. Immediately following the October 7 terrorist attacks on Israel, the Biden administration sprang into action, coming to the immediate aid of one of America's closest strategic partners by delivering military supplies, advice, and sharing intelligence. President Biden, before becoming the first American president to visit Israel in a time of war, ordered a massive U.S. military force into the Middle East for the explicit purpose of deterring Hezbollah and other Iran-supported groups from opening new fronts against Israel in an effort to deter Hezbollah. Iran's proxies and partners in the region have steadily increased their attacks on Israeli and U.S. forces while avoiding large-scale actions that could be interpreted as immediately escalating to an all-out war. For the past month, this conflict has been the leading story in news outlets across the globe and has generated a massive quantity of social media content, which has influenced and shaped popular opinion on Israel, Hamas, the broader Israel-Palestinian conflict, and the current war now ongoing in Gaza. At this very sobering time, to discuss the evolution of this media coverage, the explosion in social media content and influence, and its broader impact on the current hostilities, I'm pleased to welcome Barak Ravid. Barak is a journalist who has reported impressively and extensively on the Middle East his entire career. He is the author of Trump's Peace, the Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East, and now works from here in Washington, D.C. as a political and foreign policy reporter for Axios. Barak, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jonathan. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Before we dive in, I want to remind our virtual audience they can submit questions for Barak by navigating to cnas.org/live or on Twitter/X using the hashtag CNAS 2023. And so with that, let's begin. I'd be curious, wherever you want to start, how about some of your broad observations of the media coverage, its impact, some of the things that you've been seeing and observing?
Well, I think first, Jonathan, you know that because we talked about it several times. This was not the plan when I moved to Washington 3 months ago. The plan was that after many years, I'm covering this issue. I'll move to Washington with my family, and cover other issues, Russia, Ukraine. The small issue like China. Those kind of things. But as you are well aware, and as many of our viewers right now are well aware, and as I think any U.S. president is well aware, that when you try to run away from the Middle East comes running after you. And like President Obama and President Trump and President Biden, I couldn't pivot to China either. which is It's kind of in this tragic circumstances. It's I'm trying to find some humor. So basically, from the day the war started, I'm doing this 24/7. My editors at Axios told me, now you drop everything else. You're doing just Israel, and this is what I'm doing. And I have to say that it's kind of a strange thing to cover war in Israel from Washington. It's a very different point of view. It's actually, it's not, even though that it's covering Israel, it's almost starting fresh and new, meaning it's such a different angle into the coverage that it's just again, I don't feel burned out or bored, or I'm not waking up in the morning and say, oh, I can't believe I need to continue on covering Bibi, because it's a very different angle of coverage. So I think it's fascinating to see things from here, and it's also, I'm thinking to myself many days of, how would I feel if I was now in Israel? I mean, how would my coverage be different? So I think all in all, it's professionally, again, other than the fact that this is a huge tragedy, and even maybe being here sort of gave me the ability to continue on, covering this thing sort of, without going completely mad, because it's a lot of the things that are happening are very personal. A lot of the people that were affected are people that are very good friends of mine. Some of them too, personally. So sort of like being here, for example, I almost did not watch any Israeli television for the last month, and I in Israel, I would just watch it all the time because it's part of the coverage. But here I just said, I'm not going to watch it because it's just going to drive me crazy. So I try to cover it, again, disconnected from the coverage in Israel. And I think, again, it's different coverage, but it gave me the ability to write stories that I would not write if I was covering it from Israel.
I mean, that's very interesting. I'd like to hear you expound on that. I mean, I can sort of visualize the difference. I mean, were you on the ground, you'd be perhaps talking to IDF commanders close to the front. You might be trolling around the Knesset or the Prime Minister's office, trying to understand what's going on with the War Cabinet, using your very deep network of sources to get the latest and breaking news, which you're incredibly apt at doing. And I can understand how from here you've actually been able to report on the conflict from the perspective of U.S. policy in ways that perhaps others cannot, because you have now a foot really in both governments in both worlds. But how has your reporting been different, you think, as a result of you being based in Washington and taking this different, slightly this different perspective?
I think that first I'm trying, at least not always successfully, but I'm trying to focus on the really important stuff. I mean, the fact that you're, and especially, when you cover things for a US media outlet and not an Israeli media outlet, you need to, again, to really find the stories, to refine your coverage so that you'll find the stories that are really not only interesting, but that really matter. And not the daily grinder of a siren here, siren there, missiles here, missiles there, to try and sort of be there for the really important stories. And I always think that one of the things that we have too much in journalism is that we sometimes we report too much. And when we do it, and again, I'm not talking about like Twitter, which is like just that's the place. If you want to report 24/7 about everything, that's the place to do it, but not in, let's say, more mainstream media, because then if everything is important, then nothing is important. So I think what it gave me is the opportunity to really focus on what I think are key stories. And I'll give you an example. Okay, I had a story about the fact that the Biden administration, like a year ago, the Biden administration took 155 millimeter artillery shells from emergency storage in Israel in order to move it to Ukraine to help the war against Russia. And in the first or second week of the war, some of those artillery shells that were already moved to Europe, to U.S. military warehouses in transit to Ukraine, were just brought back. Some of them were even several boxes of shells. I even heard that were like they were already on a ship in the Haifa port, and they just said, okay, take them down. And I thought that this story was really something that it just encapsulates so many things that are important in this war. First, the fact that Israel needs 155 millimeter shells, which is something that nobody thought. People thought that this is gone. Like no one's gonna use this because we're not gonna have like a huge war. That's first. Second, the fact that how this conflict completely threw aside what we thought was the most important crisis in the world in the last 18 months. And now, I don't know, have you heard about Ukraine lately? Not a lot. So I thought it added the fact that, again, the dependence of Israel on, at the end of the day, on U.S. military and security support. So I think all of that was in a story, which is, when you think about it, it's almost an anecdote. Okay, but it's just it tells you a much bigger story. So this is example, in my opinion, for how you can, when you're a bit further away, you can focus on such stories.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically expressing you've taken a broader aperture, a more strategic approach, and it speaks to some of the national policy debates going on here in Washington about how we might be able to continue to source Ukraine's defense while continuing to now source Israel's defense. And of course, in the midst of that, China looms large over Taiwan, and there are these seemingly competing priorities. Of course, President Biden has the supplemental aid package, which seeks to cover all of those, plus the southern border, which is under debate in the House and Senate now. And we'll have to see where that ends up, of which a portion of that, about $14 billion, is slated for Israel. You're an interesting person to be talking to at this particular moment, because something that I have observed from a lot of journalist outlets is that they're getting an education on the Israel-Palestinian conflict almost in real time. And I don't know this for a fact, so this is anecdotal, but I get the sense that as media outlets have consolidated, there have been buyouts of more senior reporters, and the backroom staffs, reporters, producers, whether it be television or print, are relatively junior and really have grown up with this conflict largely frozen. Of course, there are flare-ups that occur in and around Gaza, the protective edge, cast lead, but these are relatively small in comparison to the types of things that those of us who are a little older remember in our lived experience: the Second Intifada, the bombings of buses, the Maxim restaurant blowing up in Haifa, the really visceral images that are lived experiences. And so this has really been an abstraction for many younger journalists. And what I believe I have observed in particularly the print reporting and some of the television media is a little bit of experiential learning on the job, where sources, for instance, that might have just assumed to have been good, normal sources, now over time I'm seeing them caveated in ways that seem to indicate there's a little bit more understanding of the complexity. And One example that I can think of is that in the early days, the Gaza Ministry of Health was cited just rotely on casualties in Gaza. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion how, in fact, since Hamas took over by force the Gaza Strip, the Gaza Ministry of Health, in fact, has been the Hamas-led Gaza Ministry of Health. And now in more reporting, I'm seeing Gaza Ministry of Health caveated by that, or the fact that there isn't a secondary source to confirm that reporting, or there are competing theories on how many casualties there may be. So over time, I think there's quickly being understood by many journalists who at the beginning had no idea that there is more complexity, a lot of competition in the information space, and how information coming out of the region is being used by the combatants to shape public understanding. And so things are perhaps being vetted now in a way they weren't earlier to some degree. But what is your take on that in terms of how you've seen actual reporting outlets, print, television, sort of come up to speed? And have you seen or observed in your eyes a sort of an evolution in the reporting in the past month?
First, it's always, as an Israeli, every time we have, we had the war or something like that, then, and also like on a normal day, Israel is usually an issue that gets a lot of coverage in the international press. And there's always this, this constant complaint about never-ending complaints about, coverage of Israel in the media. And I got to tell you something, that since this war started, I really think that the coverage was, again, there's always individual cases, but overall, I think the coverage, most of the coverage that I saw, both on television and in print, was very professional. And I do not think, at least I don't think that there's any, bias that, intentional bias that is driving the coverage. I really don't get that sense. I agree with you that what I do notice is there's much more, I think, the coverage is more calculated. Maybe that's, I don't know if that's the right word, but, people think twice, sometimes three times before they run things. Again, not always the case, but we have to remember also it's a war. Okay. When you cover a war, things happen fast, and they happen fast under the fog of war. When a lot of the things that are happening, you don't know for sure, not in the first minute, and sometimes not in the first week. So, but overall, under those circumstances that are very hard, people think that, it's not easy to cover. It's not easy to cover anything as a journalist. Okay. People don't want you to write things that, they would rather keep, quiet. So just think about it during a war. It's very hard. And I think that overall the coverage is really professional and fair. But again, I agree with you that there's much more. I think people are sort of re-engaging with this issue that in the last few years was an issue for a group of perverts in the policy world and in the media world. I'm proud to be one of those perverts, but I'm aware that I am a pervert. People did not want to.
I'm not sure pervert is the word we're looking for in English,
That's why that's why how I call it. It's that's how I call it. It's and I'm telling you because it's true. Think about it. In the last 2 years, or even look at it from the from the policy world. Okay, how much what was the demand for Israel-Palestine experts in the policy world in the last few years? Not a lot of demand. Okay, there was a lot of demand for China experts or people who say that they are China experts. There was a lot of demand for Russia-Ukraine experts. There was a lot of demand for AI or cyber experts. Not a lot of demand for Israel-Palestine experts, and I think that's part of the problem, because it's not a problem of just the media world or the press. It's just it's also a problem of the policy world. And this issue was sort of took it's not even a back seat. It was somewhere,
On the shelf.
on the shelf, and then again on the shelf, on the shelf in the basement. Okay, in the rented cottage. Okay, so when that's the case in the policy world, then obviously this will be the case in the press, in the media world, and I think people are catching up. There's still a lot of good reporters out there that know this issue. And I'm glad to see that some of them, I think, are also, for them, it's sort of a moment of vindication, a renaissance, that they're also, each of us as journalists, at the end of the day, we our coverage and how much exposure we get is according to what's interesting for our editors. And I think, at least I'm happy to see a lot of reporters from in the Israeli press, obviously, but also in the international press, that I really like and I really respect, and that now are once again getting to write stories in the front pages, and it's great to see.
Yeah. I just want to remind the audience that they should submit questions for my friend Barak, and you can do that on Twitter/X at #CNAS 2023, or by navigating to cnas.org/live and posting your question there. Barak, you hit on a few things that I want to circle back to. Let's start a little bit with some of that international coverage. But before that, actually, the issue of reporting and being fair, I too share your assessment that I believe largely all the reporting has come from a good faith effort to demonstrate journalistic integrity. But another interesting case study, I think, might have been the significant happening. I don't want to call it an attack, but the significant activity at Al Ali Hospital on October 17, where something exploded in and around the hospital. On Twitter, and we can get to the social media role in all of this, Hamas and Hamas adherents on Twitter were immediately saying that Israel was responsible for this in the form of a bombing. That kind of went viral around the world. That was initially the headline on the New York Times. And as more information came out, both from the Israeli government and from the US government, it appears that, in fact, what happened was Israel did not bomb the parking lot behind the hospital, but an errant rocket fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired and landed in the hospital. And the forensic evidence seemed to support that being the case. And through the course of the night to morning, the New York Times headline changed, I think, 3 or 4 times as the story was updated. But there's certainly this effect. I mean, the old adage is a lie or a mistruth has a chance to get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. And we've been seeing that more and more with the explosion of information on social media, where information travels so quickly. It's increasingly difficult to vet information, and you have to print something. So, I think, and then, of course, there was the editorial statement that came out after that from the New York Times. But everyone, I think, is somewhat susceptible to the fact that there's a lot of information flying, and sometimes it's very difficult to assess what is true, what is not, and what is actual disinformation that is being used by one of the combatants to shape the perceptions to then constrain their adversary in the war, which is absolutely something that can and does happen, not just in this conflict, but most every conflict. But I want to get to an audience question here. We have James who's asking, what can the U.S. and Israel do to improve the information to counter false and fake information from Hamas and pro-Hamas social media posting?
I think that it's directly connected to what you said, Jonathan. The case of the hospital, I think at the end of the day, it's a good test case to exactly how you do it, and you do it first with, and I think the IDF spokesman here and Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari is really doing a great job, in my opinion, especially because he's doing a lot in order to, even if it's not quick, I think more people now know that, it's the information that the IDF puts out is, especially in the case of the hospital, was reliable. And I think and the fact that they were ready to share information from their radar systems, they were ready to expose intelligence material that they had, and and engage with the media. At the end of the day, the result was that, and obviously the fact that they gave this intel to the US, and the US did its own review of the intelligence and got to the same conclusion that Israel was not involved in the hospital. At the end of the day, if you look at the narrative, I think that, again, there will always be like the people who think that the man didn't go to the moon. There are always those people, but I think the mainstream of people in the world are aware that Israel did not bomb the hospital. So even though there were headlines in the first few minutes, and also I got to tell you, we need to, I know it's something that bothers people, but again, it's a war. When you cover stuff during a war, then sometime your first report is not accurate. Okay. And it's not that, media outlets around the world reported for 3 days that Israel bombed the hospital. Okay. It was for, I don't know, between 5 to 15 minutes, and the fact that the headlines changed, I mean, is that, I just don't see that as a bad thing. I see it as a good thing, because it means that there's no bias. Nobody did anything intentionally, because if it was intentional, then they wouldn't change a headline, and this stuff happened when you cover a war. And by the way, it happens. If you ask people, they will give you this example of the hospital, but I'm not sure they'll find many more examples. And in a war that every day you have thousands of airstrikes and engagement on the battlefield, that's not bad.
Yeah, I think that's fair when we're talking about media outlets that are professional, that we know and trust by and large. But I think we have a generation, perhaps, around the world of people who are getting their media and information first and believing it to be trustworthy from social media. And while, yes, it's true that those who read the paper of record, the New York Times, eventually got the story, what I can't help but wonder is how many people, particularly in the Arab world, other regions of the world, saw those initial reports on social media from dozens of Twitter accounts sounding incredibly official and very certain, and simply walked away believing that's what happened and never revisited it. And certainly from what I've seen reported, and what have I seen anecdotally from circles that I'm within the Arab world, the belief that Israel bombed Al-Ali Hospital, again, many of the people in the region were predisposed to believe that Israel would, leaning into their priors and the scar tissue they have from the Israel-Palestinian conflict more broadly. But I'm not certain that those changes, or even the reporting coming out of established media outlets, is the thing that's doing the primary informing for many people, especially those in the Gen Z. So kind of circling back to James's question, what is your thinking on how social media is impacting people's ability, particularly younger people, to be informed about the conflict?
Yeah, but I think that here the problem is much bigger than the El Ali hospital, because again, if I think that there you can find people that still think that Hamas didn't commit a massacre on October 7th. You see people that are young people that are taking down posters of hostages from the streets of New York, and say that it never happened. Okay, so I think that the problem is much bigger. By the way, I think that one of the best ways to do it is, and it happens on its own, when you see that those people are being shamed on social media. Which I got to tell you, I think that's the
appropriate response.
What?
The appropriate response?
Yeah, the appropriate and the effective response, because if somebody is, again, tearing out posters because he thinks that this thing never happened, I just think that it's more effective than now. You'll start giving him a lecture about what really happened. I just think that it's and again, I also have to say, I think that the majority of people around the world, okay, I don't, people are not in the details. For them, it's, I think for a lot of people, it's just two tribes that are fighting, and like, can we just make them stop?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But I think that if you look at the more informed part of society, I gotta say that I think that people that are more informed and know more, even though if it's not the majority of people, I think they totally understand what happened.
Yeah. This is an interesting subject, and I'm going to put a pin in it for a minute because we have a very interesting question from Eli in our virtual audience that deviates a little bit from the specific subject we're addressing on the role of media, but I think it's a great question, and I really like your take on it. Eli asks, would you be willing to briefly address the quote-unquote day after question? What are the current options available to the Israeli government?
Well, I think that we talk a lot about the day after, and we'll talk more about the day after. But there's something that is important to remember. The people who will make the decisions about the day after are not the people who are making decisions now. Okay? Because the people who are making decisions now, at least in my humble opinion and assessment, are not going to be with us for much longer. Not the head of the Shin Bet, not the IDF chief of staff, not the head of military intelligence, not the Israeli national security advisor, not the Israeli minister of defense, and not the prime minister of Israel. Some of them might do it on their own initiative. Some of them might have to be dragged out. Some of them might have to be, chased out. I don't know, but they are not the ones who will take those decisions. And that's the biggest problem here, okay? That anyone who discusses the day after with the current Israeli leadership is discussing it with people that at least I do not think will be the people that will eventually make the decisions. I think that's part of, and all of the people that their job is to work on those kind of plans know it. So, it's like, and the politicians themselves know that they might not survive after this war. So they say, so why should we bother? Okay.
Let me dig into that a little bit, just for my curiosity's sake. are you thinking that something will follow similar to the Agranat Commission of 1973 that came after Yom Kippur, where everyone was found basically culpable and it ended the political career of Golda and the military careers of many? Or is it something that will, come through the course of an election, either planned or called for? I mean, what do you think is going to be the mechanism that drives that turnover in management and political leadership?
Well, there are many possible mechanisms. I just think that once the first phase of the war ends, which means when the reservists are being sent home, which will happen, I think, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks time, something like that. Then the next step will be a resignation of the heads of the security services. Benny Gantz and his party will leave the coalition. I think the next step is that some of the ultra-Orthodox parties will just tell Netanyahu that he needs to go for an election. I think that's where this thing is going. So and you have to remember that it comes on a fertile ground that that before the war we had 9 months of demonstrations across the country with hundreds of thousands of people participating over the judicial overhaul. A lot of those people went on reserve service now, okay, and they're going to come back from the war, and they're going to bring with them a lot of other people who are not part of the judicial overhaul protest but will now join it. And the first Saturday night after the war, okay, which again, doesn't mean that there's not going to be any fighting in Gaza anymore, but I mean, after the first phase of the war, first Saturday night, you will have 500,000 people in the streets of Israel protesting and calling Netanyahu to go.
Yeah.
And I just think that I just don't think it will be sustainable for much longer afterwards.
Yeah. You and I have discussed this a little bit, and I've been thinking about this as well. And I've been asked a similar question. And, it's important to note, and you'll remember this, I believe polling in Israel in July, before any of this began, but on the back of the judicial overhaul debate, indicated that if the election were held in July, this past July, the governing coalition, Bibi's coalition, would be down 10 seats and would be the minority coalition.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the narrative about his responsibility and culpability in the policy failure leading to this attack certainly would compound that. And you and I have discussed the issue of turnout in the last election, which actually enabled the formation of this government. I believe, if I can recall, you told me only roughly about 50% of Tel Aviv turned out in the last election. Is that accurate?
Sorry. I'm just, that's part of, the fact that we are in a war, that things are happening as we,
yeah,
as we speak.
Well, if you have news to report, this is a great opportunity.
No, it's just, that's the thing. Some of it is just not news; it's noise. Okay. But the noise sometimes gets in the way. So look, the interesting thing is that they only started doing polls again in the last week. Okay, meaning for some time they didn't want to do any polls because they didn't feel that it was appropriate. Mm-hmm. So I think it's and you start seeing that obviously the trend was already, as you said, the trend was there before, but the trend is now even, it's even stronger, and it means that again, there's between 70 and 80% of Israelis say that Netanyahu needs to resign. Okay, so it's
Let me ask this. I mean, I really want to get back to the question of social media disinformation and some of the lessons there. But before we do, because this is such an interesting subject, over the course of 2 decades, failed initiatives within the peace process have largely led to a broad belief among Israelis that the only future is conflict management and not conflict resolution. Now, it's the stated aims of the Biden administration and others that after this conflict, there be a resumption of the peace process, which ultimately ends in a two-state solution that is both just and equitable for both Israelis and Palestinians. Understanding that the decision makers for the day after likely won't be in power or are not in power today, what's your assessment of what the political atmosphere and the willingness will be of Israelis to countenance a return to a peace process after this conflict? Because I have recollections, again, this is anecdotal, but after the peace process has collapsed, under first Ehud Barak, well, Omer again, but really in the time of Ehud Barak, most of the Israeli electorate took a couple steps to the right, and basically the peace movement collapsed in on itself, and there was almost no reason for being. After this, unprecedented conflict and the atrocities, how do you think the Israeli public squares the circle of opening up in and among itself to be able to come back to a peace negotiation? I'm curious about that.
Well, I think one of the results of this war, and I think we already start seeing it, is the resurrection of the Zionist left in Israel. The Zionist left that in the last 2 decades, since what you said, since Ehud Barak, stopped calling itself the Zionist left, started calling itself the center or the center right, okay? But it's basically, again, this worldview that is very much focused on being hawkish on security, but being willing to use diplomacy. And Yitzhak Rabin is I think the best, the leader that was identified with this stream in Israeli society ever. And I think, and again, Ehud Barak was a mutation of that, but and you see that from the people who are, who are the heroes of this war until now. The heroes of this war until now are 65-year-old pensioners, generals, retired generals, that on October 7th took the car and drove to the south, found wounded soldiers, took their guns and helmets, and went to the villages around Gaza, found several young soldiers without a commander, told them, "We're your commanders," went out, killed terrorists, and rescued civilians. And it's the same people that protested against the judicial overhaul and were nicknamed by Netanyahu and his cronies as traitors, as anarchists, and all sorts of other derogatory names. Okay? And I think that this sort of, those people and are people that I think the majority of, again, mainstream Israelis identifies with them today. Mm-hmm. And so I think, a person like Yair Golan, a former IDF deputy chief of staff, that in the last few years, he was one of the most hated people in the country because he went through an incitement campaign against him by the Israeli right. Now, people all over the country say that he's a war hero, by the way, because he is. He went to the party, okay, to the rave, and saved kids on his own. He went with his car, okay, and on his own took a gun from someone and went, killed terrorists, saved kids, and he didn't have to do it. He didn't have to do it. He's 60-something. He's retired. and I think it made people understand that a lot of that those people might know something about what they're talking about, and that they're willing to make a sacrifice for the country. So I think this could be one of the results of this war and how it influences the Israeli society.
I recall when I visited Tel Aviv earlier this year, you and I actually spent some time together. And I can't recall now if it was my trip in March. It might have been my trip later in the year, but I visited and witnessed some of the protests in Tel Aviv. And one of the most interesting spectacles in the large protest, there was a mock-up of a tank. And on this tank, there were these veterans of that same demographic and age group, and they were passing out T-shirts, translated in English, basically said, veterans of the 73 Yom Kippur War fighting for the character of the state of Israel. And they were, of course, out there protesting the judicial reforms and the changes that would surely occur if those reforms were forced through the Knesset. But I think though that's the demographic that we're talking about. Another story that's been publicized, your colleague Amir Tibon was in Nachalat Oz with his family, and I believe he was rescued by his own father,
Exactly.
a former general as well. Some of the stories are incredible and harrowing.
And I'll give you another example, Jonathan, for that. Okay, since the war started, let's go back a bit. One of the bills that Netanyahu and his coalition partners were negotiating in the days before the war, was a bill to give the first time in Israel's history an exemption for ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students from military service, and to say in law that a yeshiva student, okay, who studies Torah deserves the same status and benefits as a soldier in the army. This was negotiated days before the war. After the war started, okay, just in the last month, more than 3,000 ultra-Orthodox, majority of them already were exempted from military service, went to the IDF and said, we want you to draft us. Okay? We want you to draft us. And the IDF is actually doing it. And Aryeh Deri, the leader of Shas, okay, one of our most corrupt politicians ever in our history, okay, and somebody who's not very popular, okay, his son was one of those who went to the IDF and has to be drafted, okay? And why did he do that? He did it, I don't want to say that that's the only reason. I don't want to be that cynical. But one of the reasons he did it because he understands that it's good politics. And if going to the army is good politics for an ultra-Orthodox politician, then this is an earthquake in the Israeli society. And this changes the whole, it's hard to explain how much it changes the whole dynamics within society, the whole, the divides, it really means that the day after the war, it's like this, the whole political map will just go such a huge reshuffling, because if the ultra-Orthodox now are not against going to the army, then they don't need Bibi anymore.
Right.
Because the reason that they needed Bibi and that they got stuck to Bibi like that, like super glue, is because they knew that he's the only person that is squeezable enough, and that they, to try and get such a law. If they don't need it anymore, then it means that they can have political alliances with other parts of the Israeli political map. And that changes the political situation from its core.
We're going to have to do an entire event focused on this subject and the future of the Israeli political establishment and polity and the demographics, because this is a fascinating subject we could take up an hour on its own. We have a question from Aaron about is the misinformation and disinformation do you think misinformation or disinformation will affect the way both Israel and Hamas will make future security decisions? And I'm going to just caveat this question or expound upon it for you, Barak. It does seem, based off of a lot of the social media engagement, that Hamas sort of went to school perhaps on the Ukraine conflict and have learned the lessons of both Ukraine and Ukraine supporters to try to shape public narratives in a way that, in the case of Ukraine, sought to build sympathy and support for Ukraine's defense, and in the case of Hamas, has sought to highlight civilian casualties and the plight of Palestinians in a way that is seeking to constrain or stop or forestall or end entirely Israel's ability to continue its ground campaign to destroy Hamas. What kind of impact are you seeing in decision-making, whether it be in Washington or in Jerusalem or elsewhere, as a result of what seems to be pretty sophisticated influence campaigns going on in the social media world?
First, I got to say that I think Hamas had a big problem, or still has a big problem. And this big problem, the big problem is that, they massacred 1,400 people, and they did it live on Facebook. And I think one of the reasons that the IDF is able now to have tens of thousands of soldiers in the center of Gaza City, okay, with, I gotta say, not a lot of pushback from around the world. There are some people who think that there's a lot of pushback. I don't think so, okay? The main reason for it is because of Hamas's decision to broadcast its massacre live. And I think they thought it would be a good idea in the age of social media, because they told their people, and this is something that Hamas operatives who were captured said in their interrogations, that they were asked to take videos in the GoPro cameras and also do a live feed on social media and back home to their headquarters in order for to use these videos, because they thought that this will scare Israelis. Okay, what it did is that first it shocked Israelis to the core, to the point that it united the country in 2 seconds. Okay, and created this mutual feeling that this is an existential war, and we all have to go and fight. And this is why you saw how fast the country mobilized. And second, I think if there were people that did not understand that around the world, it made it clear that this is like a genocidal terrorist organization that is sometimes make ISIS look vegan. So in a way, I think their strategy for using social media sort of backflipped on them.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't think that they really managed to recuperate since then. They're trying. I don't think they managed to do it. And by the way, the fact that there are pictures of dead children in Gaza is not because of Hamas influence campaigns, because there are dead children in Gaza. It's a fact.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a fact, and it's terrible. Okay, and it's not. I don't think it's like it's those things. Oh, Bollywood. There are Palestinian kids, hundreds, maybe thousands. I don't know the exact number, were killed in this war. Okay, and this is not an influence campaign. This is the reality, and I think that one of the things that Blinken and Jake Sullivan told the Israelis very clearly is that if you say that you need us to give you more time, and we're willing to give you more time, any picture of you bombing a refugee camp and having this amount of civilian casualties, especially children, this goes against our effort to give you more time, because you are creating your own problem. So I think that if there's if there's one thing, I was never one of those who say, oh, Israel doesn't have good enough PR. Usually when you say that you don't have good PR, it's because you have a bad policy. And what can you do? And I'm not saying if it's, I'm not even sure that it's possible to do in a place like Gaza. Okay, when you have Hamas, Hamas headquarters under the Shifa hospital, what are you supposed to do?
Right, it's a dilemma. It's a terrible dilemma.
I mean, anybody has a good idea other than just leave them there and let them continue on doing what they're doing. Okay, which is, I understand that there are people who think like that, but let's say you don't want Hamas to continue doing what they're doing. What do you propose?
Right.
I did not hear all those generals that were sent here by the US with Mosul and this and Fallujah. Nobody has a good idea. Okay, why? Because when you have such a small place with so many people and with an organization that is embedding itself within, civilian population, I mean, I just don't know how you can do it without, hitting so many civilians. This is why this thing is such a tragedy.
Right. Well, we're running short on time, but I would be remiss if I didn't take the prerogative to ask you a final question on an issue that I know you are incredibly expert in and is close to your heart. You are the author, in my opinion, of the authoritative history of the Abraham Accords. And it has been interesting to observe the media in the region. Obviously, there are certain networks that have continued to take a bend that plays on the sympathies that they historically have had. I think Al Jazeera is a great example of that. But there have been some real interesting, eye-popping outliers in the wake of the history of the Abraham Accords, and of course, the normalization process, which was well underway up until this conflict, and which appears to be ready to resume once the conflict ends. And of course, I'm speaking of Al Arabiya, which is Saudi state television. And I'm sure you've seen it, many others have seen it, but if those of our viewers don't know, an Egyptian journalist, Rasha Nabil, who was an anchor on Al Arabiya, did an interview with Hamas's Khalid Mashal and basically drove the truck over him and then backed up and asked very hard-hitting questions about Hamas's role and their culpability in massacres and how this resembles ISIS, and what are their intentions to start a regional war, and how do they justify helping Palestinians this way. And it was an incredibly hard-hitting interview, and considering it was in Arabic for a Saudi audience is really something to me. So I'm somewhat curious about where you think Saudi normalization will be. What is Saudi Arabia's intent with that type of coverage? Do you think it's been continuing that way? What's your sense on the future of Israel's continued integration into the region?
So first, there were a lot of other examples in the El Arabiya coverage and in other Saudi or Gulf media outlets that were pretty similar to this interview. I think that in El Arabiya, if you look at the terminology that they're using, it's a very different terminology, very negative coverage of Hamas, okay? Critical coverage of Israel, but negative coverage of Hamas. They do not treat Hamas as freedom fighters. They treat them as terrorists. And this is not by accident. And as far as I understand, there is a political decision behind it. And I think the political decision in Saudi Arabia is to, while being critical of Israel, because again, Israel does a lot of things that are completely legitimate to criticize during the war in Gaza. But I think what we see from the Saudis is a political decision to start trying changing the narrative about Hamas in the Arab world and make it an illegitimate or less legitimate organization within public opinions in the Arab world. And that's why you'll see that the coverage in Al Arabiya and in Al Jazeera, that Al Jazeera is obviously, funded by the Qatari government, and which uses Al Jazeera as a soft power tool. and it shows. So I think the differences are very clear, and I think that's what the Saudis are able to do right now, to signal that they're still interested in exploring the possibility of normalization with Israel on the day after the war. I think the war did change something profound in Saudi decision makers' thinking. And I think that sort of like, I don't know if you remember when the US moved its embassy to Jerusalem during Trump. Before that, the Trump administration worked with Saudi Arabia to try and coerce Abu Mazen, the Palestinian president, into taking a deal that was much more favorable towards Israel. And then when the embassy moved, there were, I think there was a lot of, especially, political, there was some stuff in Gaza, but there were also like a lot of, I think, political pushback for this. And then Mohammed bin Salman sort of took a step back, and King Salman took the issue back into his own hands. And I think what we see now is that now Mohammed bin Salman realizes again that this is not, even if he doesn't like Abu Mazen, he's not a fan of the Palestinian Authority, he's definitely not a fan of Hamas. He understands that the stability in Israel-Palestine is of profound importance to his own 2030 vision. Okay, that his 2030 vision cannot exist in a world where there's a war going on between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And this, I think, will make any future normalization between Israel include a much bigger Palestinian component than anybody envisioned before October 7th.
I think that's fascinating. Before October 7th, we were talking about a component of the normalization deal as being addressing the Palestinian issue. And now it almost seems like the issue will invert on the day after, and a normalization agreement with Israel may get pulled through the eye of the needle through discussions on the future of a two-state solution.
I would not be surprised at all if we'll find ourselves next summer in some sort of an international peace conference led by the United States and Saudi Arabia on,
all this
with Israel present.
Right. Certainly a consequential moment we're in, fascinating, troubling, but I do hear a glimmer of hope potentially on the other side, understanding how horrific the present and the recent past have been. Barak Ravid, I want to thank you so much for joining me today in this discussion. Barak, you are a fantastic reporter now with Axios, telling the story of the Middle East from an entirely different angle here in Washington. Your insights continue to be wonderful, and I do hope you are taking notes for the follow-up to your book as we see what might occur with the Saudis in the future. Thank you for your time, and I just want to thank our virtual audience for tuning in for the questions. Continue showing up. We're going to be addressing this and all the relevant issues for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East here at CNAS in our Middle East Security Program. Thanks, and have a good evening.
Thank you.